Hello, listeners. Today, the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma podcast is 1 year old, and we celebrate this first anniversary with a special episode, the number 14th, where Ravi and JAM debate about the geopolitical shift in the energy sector due to Trump's election. They will share the challenges and opportunities of the Trump's energy agenda. Is it a boom or a backfire? Ravi, JAM, over to you.
Hello, Ravi. Hello, listeners. We are celebrating today our first anniversary and the first season. We had a lot of speakers during this year coming from different companies addressing all the topics. We talked about pricing of the electricity. We talked about renewables, interconnections, decarbonization, there's solar, a lot of topics. But things are changing and the focus is shifting. Isn't it, Ravi?
Yes, absolutely, Jose. I think we had a tremendous year with several topics that we talked about over the years, a lot of which was around sustainability, on decarbonization, on energy storage, on distributed energy resources, a lot of different initiatives that was basically focused on not only improving performance and efficiency, but also achieving the net zero goals. But obviously, things have changed dramatically over the last 3 months. In the last 90 days, you can almost sense a 180-degree shift from where some of the priorities have been for a number of companies and countries around the world. In fact, one major significant event, of course, after the election of the US President Donald Trump has been the shakeup in the energy policy, which has a tremendous impact on unlocking the energy trilemma. A key issue has been the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, that at least from a US standpoint, it ends the US commitment to global emission reduction targets and also shifts the climate leadership responsibility to individual states, to individual corporations, and we have seen, as a result, a number of companies actually leaving the net zero commitment. What's your view on that? We've heard some big names leaving the net zero commitment.
Big banks left the Net Zero Bank Association, and BlackRock left the Net Zero Asset Management Association. And if you remember, all this stuff about sustainability started years ago when Larry Fink sent the first letter to their investees saying you must take care of sustainability targets. And from there to now, a lot of things have changed. And probably this is not only a public support of withdrawal the Paris Agreement, but even an investment support that a shift in the economics of the investments is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if we go back 12 months, a lot of what we focused on and our speakers and our audience had as a top priority was, for example, grid modernization was a big part of the agenda and was a big part of the investments. EVs were making a lot of inroads in many countries around the world and in many markets wherever they were economical, even in spite of the high cost of initial purchase of electrical vehicles. We also saw a lot of interest in CO2 capture and green hydrogen and a lot of projects around the world, not just in Western Europe and the Scandinavian countries, but also in the United States. And obviously a lot of energy storage investment, which to some extent continues to remain a good opportunity. And of course, a lot of ESG initiatives, which I think is now at the crossroads with what we have seen. And we can get into some of the specific plans as it impacts the United States and what kind of a ripple effect it would have on some of the European countries and some of the other markets around the world. But clearly, in my view, what was seen as high priorities seem to have gotten deprioritized. What do you think? What is your impression about that?
I think the priority of the investments is now more in the fundamentals, in the typical economics, the figures that support the economy, rather than let's invest here because it appears more sustainable, but probably the business case doesn't make any sense. So I think there is a shift to come back to the basics of the economics, which is, it could be good, definitively. And there is another shift in, you've mentioned the greed and the necessity to increase the greed in many countries. And for example, in the States, the new agreements with nuclear power plants over the counter don't need such great increase of capacity and so on. So probably these over the counter agreements are the new age in big consumption of electricity, data centers, artificial intelligence, and so on.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of increased acceleration of infrastructure and AI projects, and you can see a lot of behind the meter type applications that involve a combination of perhaps a simple cycle gas turbine plus your renewable to the extent that it is feasible, plus energy storage, plus perhaps access to clean coal technology as well, that could actually serve as a good backup base form of generation. Projects such as SMRs, they seem to be more, in spite of the high cost, seem to be potentially viable over the long run. Nuclear energy certainly is looking at a more optimistic future. I mean, a lot of the nuclear plants are designed to survive about 80 years, and many of them are just at a 40-year mark at this moment. So they have a good 40 years of potential life out there, which I think under the new shift in policies is expected to be utilized to the fullest extent possible, because they not only provide clean power, but then quite reliable baseload power as well, and could be that impetus that you need to support all this new power demand.
Yep. And you've mentioned Europe, and definitively part of the Trump tsunami is coming to Europe. The LNG export approval will mean more gas to Europe, and the new relationship between the US and the OPEC will impact the European countries definitively. In Europe, there is a shift in terms of the former European Green Deal, now to the competitiveness compass is the name of the new plan. And really the name is pretty definitive, because we are talking more about energy efficiency. And renewables, wind and solar mainly, will remain in the mix, but the rest of the options will have to be sustainable from an economic point of view, not only from a, let's say, a green point of view. And the fact that some countries such as Denmark, with the second public bid of offshore wind, has been empty, no bidders, or the change that in Norway the government has fallen because they were insisting in implementing the European directive of interconnectivity of countries, are going to change things in Europe too.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you go down and dig deep into some of the Trump energy policy, right? It's still early stages and things could change dramatically. But from what we see, one of the critical elements is the fact that withdrawing from the Paris Agreement certainly removes the pressure on a lot of corporations across the globe, or even across the United States for sure. And there's also a lot of support to roll back electrical vehicles and potentially energy tariffs on Chinese equipment, especially solar panels and lithium-ion battery storage technology. There's also some uncertainty about renewable energy, especially the crackdown on wind energy and offshore wind. This is a lot of permits around offshore wind leasing is going to be in a standstill, and this creates a lot of uncertainty for companies like Ørsted and others who are very much involved in a lot of the offshore wind projects. Another big item is the potential funds from the Inflation Reduction Act and from the IJA, and potential rollbacks of tax credits on clean hydrogen and potentially certain types of carbon capture projects could be impacted as well. So these are, significant areas that would be impacted. And then areas that would see a lot of support would be obviously LNG exports. The pause that was on LNG exports has been lifted, which could potentially mean acceleration of a lot of pending projects. So a lot of the LNG developers in the Gulf Coast, for example, would benefit from that. Potentially a boost in oil and gas production. This could mean a lot of drilling, and this is totally reversing the restrictions from the previous era. As we talked about, a lot of AI data center infrastructure related growth and potentially on-site generation using a combination of technologies that are economical. Potentially a lot of critical minerals would be developed as well, reducing dependence on potentially Chinese batteries and nuclear fuels from certain countries. So a lot of different initiatives in a mixed bag, fossil fuel revival for sure, especially gas-fired. Combined cycle plants, you'll see a lot of growth in combined cycle plants because they provide that base load power that you need for the AI growth that we expect. And potentially some kind of scale back on the whole ESG pressures. So that could drive a lot of new investments in oil, gas, and potentially some reliable renewable fuels as well. Yeah.
There is a concept which is the CO2 tax, and these markets could set up the big milestone, because if in one side we have the States or some Asian countries that are not recognizing the CO2 taxes, they are not imposing those taxes to their corporates, their corporates are going to be more competitive in the global market in comparison with those from Europe or other regions that are imposing those CO2 taxes and making the prices of the energy or the electricity more expensive and the final products more expensive and so less competitive. So I think this is going to be like the big milestone if at the end the world is following this path of putting taxes on CO2 or not. And China is postponing the CO2 peak. They are investing in new coal-fired power plants. Probably they won't use them in base load as they were used in the past, but definitively the CO2 emissions will continue growing during some additional years. There's going to be a very big shift on the approach to CO2 emissions.
Yes, I would think so. I would think now there are always going to be countries in European countries that are very committed to the sustainability cause. Many of the Scandinavian countries that will continue to make significant investments in sustainability and in decarbonization. I expect laws like CBAM, for example, to continue to be in place. As a result, companies that are exporting into those areas, into those regions, would continue to have the pressure of meeting and investing in technologies that require to be green. And and that could be across the world. So whether you're in the United States and you're exporting into those countries and are potentially impacted by CBAM, for example, you would continue to make those investments. But overall, it would be measured in a more granular fashion against the payback and the cost and the ROI. So I expect that you would see a resurgence in cleaner thermal fuels, potentially nuclear fuels, combined with renewable energy and potentially cost-effective energy storage, and shifting focus back to oil and gas and easing the ESG pressures. So these are areas that we can expect some corporate investment, and of course, with these kind of seismic shifts that are in motion, I also expect a lot of legal and investment battles that will unfold because uh, a lot of companies have made plans and investments based on these funding and based on these incentives and based on these tax credits and are well underway. And to find them in a position where they are not able to encash on them is going to create quite a lot of unhappy project developers. And who stands to win or lose is still unclear at the moment. It's still early days, but most definitely there's a huge shift in the way the wind is blowing. Yeah.
Yeah. And following your comment, for me, 2025 will be an important year to understand and to be aware of the cost of being more sustainable. Being more sustainable is fantastic, but
Right.
the only problem is that it's more expensive. And the public speech about that was the opposite. Wind and solar are cheaper, but you have to pay twice for all the infrastructure of the total system. So in many cases, the total cost of the energy system to make cheaper some hours of the electricity is higher. And probably 2025 will be the year we'll be aware of this shift and will be able to make decisions on one technology or the other.
Absolutely. And I'll be very curious to see how some of the major green corporations around the world, like your Googles and your Microsofts and Meta and others who had committed to 100% green energy to basically power their AI and data center requirements. Will there be a shift in their position? Will they be ready to settle as opposed to focusing on 100% decarbonized energy scenario? Will they focus more on lowering carbon intensity and using a combination of cost-effective technologies, given the shift in focus? That's obviously going to be a big question, unanswered question, and it'll take the next several months to figure out what their change in position would be. Yeah.
Great, Ravi. I think it has been a fantastic year. We had very interesting conversations. We encourage you, dear listeners, to cherry pick those that could be more interesting for you and re-listen to them. And we open season 2. We'll bring new experts in the energy sector, and we expect to have very interesting and controversial conversations.
Exactly, Jose. I think we will be watching the market very closely, and we will be looking at technologies and policies and regulatory issues and corporate initiatives and how they prioritize certain fuels over the others and how they prioritize their clean energy policy versus the economics. And we will be monitoring that very closely. And a lot of our speakers will be adding more clarity for our viewers as well as they make these choices. So I think it'll be a fantastic year going forward, and we will be bringing in speakers with that objective in mind so that this helps investors and developers and all those stakeholders in the energy industry get more clarity on where the industry is headed. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Jose.
We hope you liked this conversation. Follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe for free to the podcast on the platform of your choice: Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or Apple. Because in the next episode, Ravi and JAM will speak with Sonia Dunlop, CEO of the Global Solar Council, who will help us to unlock the energy trilemma.